I think you probably recognize me as the dad of the guy that you like coming up when Jerry's not here. But my son Lad couldn't make it, and I told him I could. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I've got something for you this morning. I thought with a lot of congregations, I know that Chuck and I actually talked about this before, but Jerry and I have talked about it a number of times. I have a little group of people that are either ministers or elders or youth ministers that we talk about church things the way that, football coaches. Yes, I believe I am. Yeah. Can you hear me in the back? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yeah. So, all right. Chuck, I don't know what they can hear, but guy in the back corner gave me a thumbs up, so he's the meter. There you go. He's the litmus test. So anyway, I have this little group. I should say it's little. It's probably, 12, 13, 14 guys. And so I asked them, hey, what are things like at your congregation, now that we're supposedly coming out of COVID, and what have you guys seen? And they're in different settings. Some of them are urban settings like where we're at Rivergate. Some rural settings, if you will, like this, and then anywhere in between. And so one of the things that it's been my perception personally is that we feel a little down about church right now. And that's a way to put it. We feel like, our numbers haven't quite rebounded. Maybe you guys per se don't, but I mean in general, when I talk to other congregations, some of their leaders, they feel that way. And it's funny, as we talk, everybody's setting's a little different, but we all seem to have really, really similar concerns. Maybe that's the way I put it. I'm not going to say they're problems, but things that we're concerned about. I've still got some folks that are just watching from home, and I still got some folks that we don't know where they went, and all that sort of thing. Well, prior to COVID, in 2018, I took a class. We had a really nice, about a 40-member class that we called Home Builders, and they were supposed to be primarily young married couples, but it had evolved over the years into a group of people who were just interested in topical study as opposed to maybe some of the other different classes that we offered there at Rivergate. And so one of the things that we were talking about was what I was about to personally get involved in, which was starting a young professionals class and sort of a young professionals ministry. When I say young professionals, inside most Christian religious bodies, and that's no different in our brotherhood, we tend to have a tremendous amount of things that put in place. Programs for little ones, children's ministries, youth ministries. We do this thing where we slice and dice and we make sure that we have many, many pieces in place for our children and our young people all the way up until they turn 18, graduate high school, and step off of the dock into the boat of the rest of their lives. And then it tends to be, not everywhere is it this way, but it tends to be that there's this gap. About the time you get married, you got some young couples or young families classes, and you have sort of a ministry that happens there. But there's this life stage, there's this gap that's in between there. And that's what we started calling young professionals. I've got a buddy over in the West Nashville area. He runs a group like this, and they call them YACs, young adults college age. So there's just a lot of different things. And so I was looking at that. That's immaterial to you, I would guess. And why we're going to look at this today. So one of the things we started looking at was there was some statistics about that particular age group that just sent chills down my spine. And I can remember I became an elder in 2018. And I can remember 4 or 5 months into that, I'd have been looking into this. And I sat with our other elders and said, guys, if you'll give me permission to devote my attention a little bit, I would like to start ministering to this age group. And so we went through some of these things. But that home builders class that I've been working with, and this was the class, everything from, I even had some high school students into some folks who were 30 years older than me in this class. And one of the things when I was talking about this to them, that I was going to be stepping away from that class to go do this, is I started digging into statistics inside the churches of Christ. Don't know if you know this name. Some of you folks may, maybe you don't. A guy named Flavel Yeakley. He passed away not too long ago, but for years, he was what we considered among the brotherhood the church statistician. He kept records. He actually worked, and he had a PhD. He taught, I believe, for quite a while at Harding. But one of the things that he did was just population research. And he did it outside of religion, but he specifically did it for the churches of Christ. And by the way, if you've ever, I bet you guys have one probably here in this congregation, had this big phone book thing, and if you were going to go take a trip, well, we got to run out to Leavenworth, Kansas, right? Got to visit some family out there. I don't know why I picked Leavenworth. I don't have any family there. And I know there's a big prison there, so I don't want you to think badly that way. But ultimately, you go get this big book and you say, what are the churches along the way in case we want to stop? And he's the guy who put that together. He kept up with all that stuff. But he would run statistics, and so I'm kind of a numbers guy. I like stats. I'm very much an analyst type person. And so we were looking into that. And one of the things prior to COVID was you kept hearing that the church has plateaued. You know, we heard, the church in the 50s and the 60s, even in the 70s, was the fastest growing religious body in America. And I will tell you that was true. And then you'll hear from the pulpit or from different places, you'll hear things like, well, this is why it was that way, and this is why it's not that way today. And I can remember in the late 80s and early 90s, it was, well, it's really slowing down. We're still growing, but we're not growing at that pace. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, well, we've plateaued. And then when we get into the 2010s, we start saying, we've crested. And that roller coaster is starting to go downhill. At least that was the feeling we were getting at the pit of our stomach. And so, all that being said, I looked to Flavel and his statistics to give me some numbers about whether my concerns were warranted of what my eyes were seeing about this particular life stage I call young professionals. And so it led me to read his book, his last book, and then I went through a series of statistical books, not just with him, 2 or 3 other studies, and then ultimately made this class up. And we did this class for 7 weeks. And it was a class that says why they left. And it's actually a study. And we're going to get into this just a little bit, but it's really more about a study of when someone walks away from a congregation, why is that? Now, that's a long reach around your elbow to touch your nose kind of thing to explain why we're looking at this today. But my guess is you've had somebody walk away from this congregation before. Just a guess, not pointing fingers, right? The fact is we all have. And if we will take a good close look at why that is, it may be different for Red Bull in the Springs versus Rivergate versus name anybody else. But there's some commonalities. There's some common factors. And there's a Christian spiritual element to it that we as bona fide, washed in the blood folks, we ought to take a look at. So anyway, we're going to start with this scripture. My brothers, if any among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. One of my favorite verses, if I were debating, and maybe that's not the best term, but if I'm talking with someone about the Calvinistic doctrine of once saved, always saved, this is often my linchpin. I don't start there, but I often end there. Very, very quick when you get to James. It's the last 2. I'm reading out of the ESV. I've come to find that over the years, that one has been one that is the best version of English, although I'm still a New King James Version fan as well. I've got another verse up here. I won't call it a companion verse, but it's about the same thing. And you may not have ever quite recognized it because it's right at the end of Jude. You know, Jude is just a one-page book, one chapter if we think of it that way. But it says, hey, Jude's given his salutation warnings. And this is a little short message to the churches to be read all over the place. But he said, hey, have mercy on those who have doubt. Save others by snatching them out of the fire. To others, show mercy with fear, hating even the garment stained with flesh. So here we are. We're talking about, in this class today, the jumping off point of studying why maybe someone walks out those doors but don't come back in those doors next week, or the next week, or the next week, or the next week. So let's get started, though, with A, the idea that we're going to look at that, but then B, the idea about what our response might be. And if I had 7 weeks to go through things with you guys, this is what we might do. I don't remember if this is a pointer or not. It's not. So first of all, we would probably want to seek to define why people were leaving. Not really going to get into that today. We might also be able to learn some lessons from those people who are leaving, though, and that's actually a little bit of what we're going to look at today. And then we might make corrections where corrections are needed, because frankly, if corrections aren't needed and people are walking away, then okay. You know, so we might have to accept that. You realize that in Jesus' day, inside the Roman Empire, I know it lasted a long time, so it's really difficult to say what the estimates are, but we're gonna be on the lower end of the estimates. 45 million people living in the Roman Empire when Jesus was walking the earth. 45 million people. How many folks did he convince to follow him out of that 45 million? Okay, say, well, Jesus didn't go all over the place. That happened after his death, after the church was established. Okay, fine. Let's get down to the end of Acts. Let's get down to around 80, 62-ish, somewhere in there. Roman Empire still going to be, let's call it 50 million. They've gained a little bit, gained some more ground, right? How many folks, I know that the church grew, and it grew at a nice pace, but how many really, out of all the people that they talked to, how many people became followers? And then you start thinking about that wide gate, and you start thinking about that narrow gate, and when you really look at the numbers are going to be in the thousands. Could we even say they got up to 1 million strong? We don't really know, but most of the estimates don't have it anywhere close to that. 50 million people versus, let's say, 50,000. That helps it in perspective, because sometimes I think as folks that are looking at us today, we look backwards in time and we feel like we've somehow lost ground, and I don't know if that's really truly the case. And that's what I wanted us to look at today. I want to encourage you with some statistics. Hey, they're eye-opening, some of them, and some of the other ones are, I don't know, to me they're a little bit thrilling. So let's take a look at a couple of things. By the way, I went past, I'm trying to go backwards, and I'm doing nothing but going forwards, and I don't know why. Oh, that's how you go backwards. Now I figured it out. My bad. So the first thing I want you to look at, you may not be able to see all these, so I'm sort of going to read them off just a little bit. Back in 2000, there was I won't say groundbreaking, but it was really a solid study. It happened through actually 1998 and 1999, and was released in 2000, all because of that whole, end of the millennium thing. And there was some really good statistics. These numbers that I have up here are not going to be the same now. We're 22 years later. I will tell you that in general, the numbers, in more or less in general, are very, very similar. But there are some specific differences. But what I want to point out, the 14th largest religious groups in the United States. Basically what I have is, of the membership, I've listed the 14 people or 14 groups of Christianity that's out there that have 1 million members or more. That's really what you have listed. Right at the top of the group, you have the Catholic Church, and they claim a membership of 62 million inside the United States. Then you've got Southern Baptist Convention, which is a whole collection or family of various types of Baptists. And they've got around 20 million. Then United Methodist Church around 10. Lutheran Church, and it's that specific one, 5 million. And then you've got the Churches of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We would also know them by the name of the Mormons. They're sitting up at just over 4 million. Presbyterian Church, about 3 million, a little more. Assemblies of God, you may not recognize them as much because they often just have a church name that you don't really know it's Assemblies of God. I know in our area, Flo, what's the name of the big one? Cornerstone. Cornerstone is Assemblies of God. So if you happen to know the Nashville area, the Madison area, big church building, they do some a bunch of things that are on TV. I know that one of the big things I always see is they have a rodeo sometimes inside their church building, and on 4th of July they have fireworks at the worship services. I'm not throwing darts. I'm not throwing stones. I'm just telling you that's how I know that they're there, and they are Assemblies of God. And then there's some other breakdowns, but you don't see the Churches of Christ until you get down past. By the way, there is a United Churches of Christ. That's not groups from our group or splinters or whatever you want to consider. They're not from the Restoration movement. They're very much something else. But anyway, then you've got down toward the end, Churches of Christ. I've got 1.6 million. I'll tell you right now, we think we're more about 1.45 million in the United States now. Most of these numbers have dropped. If you were to say 10%, you're probably grabbing a pretty good number. There are a number of those now that are much less than 10%. But that's not really the stat I want to show you as much as the positioning. This is what I want to show you. Then there are two other groups up there that you may or may not have a tremendous amount of knowledge about. There are the Christian churches and Churches of Christ. That is a category that Flavel developed, and I'll show you why, and it is a necessary category. There's around 1.4 million there. And then there's the Christian church, and if you've seen them, that's that one that has on their sign a chalice, and it has like a red cross in the middle of it, and they'll say Christian church, and it'll often say Disciples of Christ, right at 1 million, okay? Now, like I said, those numbers are of 2,000, so let's get down to business. Who are the Churches of Christ? That's really something. I don't know how often I heard this in a Sunday school class, certainly very rarely out of a pulpit. It's not easy to put into a sermon type thing, but you don't have to worry about a sermon for me because I'm not a preacher. I tell people all the time, I'm the unpreacher. I only teach. I couldn't be a preacher, and I never want to be. It scares me. But I will tell you that I do enjoy teaching, and this is the type of thing that I think probably you'll only get in a very much an extended topics class. So who are we? Well, what I want to do is it might be a really good idea for us to understand the basic history. I'm not going to go super in depth, but the basic history of where we came from, okay? So first of all, the Church of Christ has no organized church government. There's a genius in that we'll touch on a little bit later, and it's actually really encouraging. But we don't have a synod. We don't have a congregation or a congress. We don't have a convention. We don't have some kind of hierarchy where there's an eventual person at the top where the buck stops there. Although I think all of us would agree that we do have that person, the buck stops at the Lord Jesus Christ. The word is what we go by. But there isn't some group of people telling us what part of the word we need and don't need and all that sort of thing. No human creeds, right? But yet, and this stat is actually up to date, we've got 75%, actually it's about 78% of our congregations exist with about 85% of adherents, and we'll talk more about what that means. And they are so similar that there is no barrier to fellowshipping. What do I mean? That means Louis Kuykendall doesn't feel like he can has to dodge going to Red Bull and Springs because of some doctrinal issue. That's really what we're trying to say. We understand that vernacular, but when you're trying to teach people who may not be part of the church, you got to write it a little more like that, and that's actually part of what was going on with this class. So anyway, more than 3/4 of us can go and feel okay about walking in the doors and sitting down and worshiping with another 3/4 of us, and we don't have any government. We don't have anybody saying, hey, Charles, you run things the way that we said run things so that it's all smooth, right? And then, hey, Chuck, don't you get things out of order. We don't have anybody doing that. We got a plan. We got the New Testament pattern, that's what we have, right? It's remarkable, and there's a genius that comes with it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So anyway, that other 25%, they have a number of groups, and I'm going to point them out to you, not to throw stones, okay? Because I've actually been to at least one little congregation that will show up in here, but I just want to describe it to you, okay, so that you understand it. So we've got some other groups, right? So we've got a mutual edification group. Those are folks who essentially don't believe that you should pay a preacher. They're relatively small, but part of that 25%. Then you're going to have one-cup groups. Flo and I actually didn't realize it, but we went to one of these congregations. They were the sweetest people in the world, and it just so happened, because we tend to be front row-ish type people, we drank from the cup first. I don't mind drinking after Flo, but I'm so glad I wasn't where Chuck was when the Lord's Supper happened, because we didn't know. And I would have felt awkward about that. I'll be the first to tell you. Though I'll tell you, they divided it up, and they had 2 cups going down, so maybe they, among their group, were even a liberal group. I don't know. So, yes?
Hair straws will be okay.
Okay, fair enough. What do you do now, though? Seriously, when COVID came along, this is a little congregation that's close to where my mom lived in Georgia, where we go and visit her and happen to be there on Sunday. I think we went there twice, didn't we, Flo? I think so. But ultimately, I worried and wondered, because they probably didn't have 20 people there, but I really wondered how they handled that. And I wish I could know, I just don't. Here's another one. There is a non-class. There are churches that oppose Sunday school. There's one of those down in the Hendersonville area that are relatively close to here. And then there's non-institutional. There's 2 or 3 of those I can say right there in our area that we have driven past. One of them is not there anymore. They basically died. And they don't believe in cooperative support, and that kind of goes back to some other throwbacks of things we really don't see too much today. But anyway, so there's a lot of that group there. Now, there's one big thing that's not up on there, and I think most of us understand. It doesn't have a name, but I know that there's a group of those folks who've decided, hey, instrumental music is okay, or Saturday church is okay, or concerts for worship is okay. Give it any name you want, but I just don't have a category for them, but we do know that they exist. But they're relatively small number. I'm not saying they're small number in their attendance, but they're relatively small number as far as the statistics are concerned. But basically, of the ones that I mentioned here, they all practice immersion. They all have a weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. And all of them that I have on the board here have a cappella worship, and all have historical roots in the Stone Campbell movement. So what's the Stone Campbell movement? All right, so Stone Campbell movement started right after we became a nation. A lot of people don't realize that. We think about it in the 1800s because it became more formalized, but realistically, the thinking that the church needs to have independent congregations was probably very much fostered by the idea that we needed to be an independent nation. So we're looking around the 1790s up through the 1840s. Out of Cane Ridge, Kentucky, Barton W. Stone was a particular minister. There were a number of ministers out there, but he was a particular well-known minister who began to plead for the unification of all Christians by following the original New Testament pattern. Thomas and Alexander Campbell, not necessarily together at the moment, that's a father and a son, by the way, but they did this at different places, at different times, began a quest to restore the original New Testament church. Now, I got to bring this up. Those sound like the same intent, and they are not. And you will see that that's not quite the same intent. One says, I want to unify the church. How am I going to do that? Well, then we'll do that by following a New Testament pattern. And we are like, woo, cheers, high five, preach, right? So then we have the other one who says, look, we want to restore the New Testament church. And you do that through the New Testament pattern. Those sound really similar, but I think what you're going to see is there's enough difference between those two mindsets that it did cause or leave an imprint. And so we'll continue on with that. Anyway, Alexander Campbell and them, they started realistically around the West Virginia, over into southern Ohio, over into really eastern Kentucky area, but mostly West Virginia. Just a side note, I see people giggling over here. Just in case you don't know, the most famous of all of the family feuds happened out of a Church of Christ over in the West Virginia area. And I'll leave it at that, only because I don't want to dive off into that, though it's fascinating. Two groups began independently to more or less do the same thing at the same time, and eventually they cemented their fellowship with a handshake in 1832, talking about the Stones and the Campbell, the people who were behind them. Both groups sought biblical names for congregations. The Campbells had come to use Disciples of Christ, and Stone had begun to call his group the Christian Church, and both of them also used the name Churches of Christ. Okay? Now, as time went on, the two groups worked in fellowship all the way really through the Civil War, but primarily from 2 points of view. Remember, Stone wanted unity among all Christians. The Campbells, that side of it, and there were many others who were working. There were many other preachers. It's almost an insult to all those who worked real hard to only mention those two, but this is a historical categorization, not necessarily one where we're trying to give credit where credit is due. Just trying to explain what happened in a very short period of time. So ultimately, eventually, three groups merged out of this. One group being the Churches of Christ as you know today. Then the Christian church, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then this one category that is Christian churches and Churches of Christ. And here's the basic rundown. You have Churches of Christ as you know it. Then you have Christian churches and Churches of Christ, that group, and they would look really, really, really similar to Red Boiling Springs Church of Christ, with the exception they would have some mechanical instruments music. That's what I'm trying to say. They would actually have that. Other than that, you're not going to see much difference between them. Then you're going to have the Christian church, and early on, you would think of them very similar as the group I just mentioned, but with this drive for unification, what really started happening was they started becoming more accepting of other thought processes than the New Testament pattern in order to unify people. They widened what they would, I hate to use the word tolerate, but we'll say what they would accept in order to unify groups. And by 1906, the Churches of Christ and the Christian church officially said, you know what, there's enough difference. We can't call each other brethren from the standpoint that we would hold tent meetings together, that we would, what we now call fellowship. Doesn't mean they didn't say hi to them down, on Main Street. I'm not saying that. But it was a scenario where they didn't feel like, as a religious body, that they were congruent enough to remain as a unified group. So the Christian church chose unity over the New Testament patterns and sought to accept other denominations' practices to foster that unity. And this led to actually a pretty liberal theology. I have a couple of friends. I have a couple of co-workers, an old boss that's a member of one of the biggest, if not the biggest one in Nashville. And we've talked about some of these things. And this would be, obviously you would see instrumental music in there. You would also see women in leadership roles. You would see things that probably, I'm only saying probably because I don't know everybody individually, you would probably think of as very, very much on the liberal side of things. So anyway, that's where we sit. By the way, by the time you hit 1957, you have the Christian church fully embracing that ecumenical movement to the point that they had open membership. And it led to many Christian church congregations to subdivide and go back with that other group that said, look, we believe all the stuff that the Church of Christ believe, but we believe that you could have kitchens in the church. That was another dividing factor, but you can have instrumental music. And so part of them went to that. So that's why we have those three subcategories. Now, that left these three groups this way. Now, if you go back and you look, the last two are really similar, excepting mechanical instruments music. So if we've looked at what the church is and how we got to where we got to, now what I want to do is I want to look just at what we call the churches of Christ. And I think that this is where the genius I talked about before. 36% of the congregations in our country have less than 50 people. And on the surface, you may go, oh, that's sad. Hang on to that. A little more than a third have less than 50 people. Around 2/3 have less than 100 people. Okay? Y'all didn't know you were a mega church, did you? I had a friend that we were trying to get to come to Rev Brigade and at that time, I think we had around 280 on a Sunday morning. And they came from a congregation of about 15, 16, 20 people, something like that. It was made up of just 3 people. And so we were trying to get them to come. They're dear people, still dear friends of ours. And he kind of made the statement, said, you know, my wife, she's just not comfortable with one of these mega churches. And I have to still chuckle because I don't think of Rivergate, just like I'm sure you don't think of yourself as a mega church. But, you know, when you have less than 100 people or less than 50 people, that puts you in a setting that's a little different than, you know, ones that aren't. So most of them have very little contact with other congregations. That I actually kind of find is sad. One of the other things I want to point out, though, is they often feel as if they are the only congregation of the Lord's church left in the world. Now, let me tell you something. My guess is if you've had a few of those little thoughts before, too. Even though we can drive down the road and find a perfectly viable congregation of the Lord's church, and we can drive a little further down the road and find another perfectly viable congregation of the Lord's church, we tend to get that circle the wagons feel. So here's what I want you to pick out of what I had to say today. We're 10 minutes left. Perfect timing. The perception, I believe, exists that they belong to a small, unimportant group that's badly divided and declining. And I just don't actually think that's the case. Are numbers shifting? I will grant you that. Are we badly divided? I don't think it's quite like what you might think or what you might be afraid that it is. Now, so what's the truth about the current state of the church as Christ, the best we can know it? Look at this. Here's our group again. We're down there at third from the last, if you want to look at it that way, with the other 2 Church of Christ Restoration type churches, you know, bring it up. I'm not saying we're cabooses by any means. There are many other groups past this, but these are 1 million or more groups in theirs. But let's take a look at this. Among those major religious bodies, ranked by membership, we We are the biggest of our three. There are some groups that don't actually submit all their statistics, so some of those statistics are, I'm just going to tell you, sort of estimated, probably overestimated. But this is interesting. I know you can't read it, so I'll read it. American religious bodies ranked by attendance as a percentage of membership, including the 14 largest. This actually has a few more than that, but including those 14 largest bodies we've already put in there. So if you take the membership that they claim, and then you take how many people actually come on a Sunday morning, look at that. The Churches of Christ are ranked number 1, have been for 50 years or better. I'm an elder, and if I only got 76% of my people coming, I don't feel great about that. And that's actually what I got right now. But on the other hand, in the setting that we are in the world that we live in, that literally every single day challenges, imposes upon you that there is no God, that there never was a Jesus, that you're idiots if you believe in this religion thing. In that kind of world, I'll take being first place among all those. I'll take that. I'll absolutely take that. Let me show you something else. These are those major religious bodies, those 14 religious bodies, ranked by their number of congregations. Now, you say what you will about say what you will about the little bitty congregations, okay? There was a little bitty congregation on Pine Lick, Fort Creek, that taught me the Bible. When my family of 6 moved there, we went from having 15 members to 21. And my family, all me, my 3 brothers, a now sister-in-law, but at the time a girlfriend of one of the brothers, we're all baptized there. We're all taught the truth there. And a bunch of other people who are now my age. You know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know what you call your daughter's mother-in-law if you're your daughter's husband's mother-in-law. So I don't know what that relationship was. But she went to that congregation too, Crystal, just to let you know. So I'm not for sure. Just for a little while, she visited over there. So if that wasn't convoluted enough, I'll get back to this. Here's my point. There's a hand of God involved when you are 14th, or I'm sorry, you are, 12th out of 14 in membership in this country, and yet you are 4th in the number of congregations you have. There's another stat, and it's a complicated stat, but it essentially says by county, how many counties across America are you represented in? We're also number 1 in that. We have an actual congregation in more counties than any other religious body in the United States. But it's a complicated statistic, so I stopped trying to explain it. I think that gives you what you need to know. By the way, that number is now down in the 12,000s. I'll tell you that now. We've lost the number of congregations. We have. But also all those other numbers are pretty low as well, or probably even more so. There are a number of those that I'll tell you, Southern Baptist, probably holding their own, but those next 2 groups, because of their stances on homosexuality, has lost a lot of followership. A lot of adherence has stopped. By the way, those other 2 groups that were on the triad that came out of the Stone Restoration movement, still down there at the bottom, okay? And one of them losing ground quickly. Let me show you one other thing. When I go back and we talk about attendance, there's some that don't give reports, but among those 3 out of the Campbell movement, they one of the groups the Christian church does. Isn't that amazing to me that only a quarter of your people attend your services? And by the way, that's at least once a month. I think most of the churches of Christ are going to have people there a whole lot more than just once a month. It's amazing to me. I mean, realistically, it's amazing to me that you would have that many people that would claim to be members but don't actually attend. But on the other hand, there you go. I'll mention one other thing. We're quickly running out of time. I do have current statistics on those attendances now. They've dropped a little because everybody's looking at COVID. Everybody's trying to figure it out. They've dropped a little, but not as much as you might think. Certainly in the ranking, basically about the same. So let's ask some questions. What about our youth? Okay? And when I say youth dropout rate, I'm not talking about the youth we have that are inside the youth program and everything down. But, boy, once you turn 18 and you walk out the doors, this might be the most symptomatic thing that I think that we as individuals could work on, that we as individual congregations could work on, which is one of the reasons why I'm focused on the young professionals. This one scares me. If you go and you look and you take a poll of all the campus ministers from brotherhood schools, okay, I'm not talking about the University of Georgia, University of Alabama, all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about brotherhood schools. You go and you look at what they say is going on. And then there's the survey I've got up here. It is only out of the 1990s because that's what you had. But ultimately, Yeakley says that over the past 30 years, that roughly 55% of our people, when they turn 18, will stay in the church. That's almost half won't stay in the church. And I'll just give you the overall instead of reading every one of those individual ones. But it breaks down more like this. Almost half of our people walk away. If they're going to walk away, they're going to walk away between 18 and when they start a family. When they walk away, about half of them, so about 25% of them, not quite 25%, are going to go to another Christian religious group. And then the other half are going to remain unaffiliated. And those are a little bit chilling. But half are still there. Those half, they need to be ministered to, in my opinion. The other half need to be sought after, don't get me wrong. And I guarantee you there are families that are. But as a congregation, if you want to change that, then it'll take a little bit of focus. It'll take a focus on that age group. Most of our other age groups stay relatively constant. But if you lose that much out of that big of a life stage, that's where you're seeing those loss of congregations. That's where you're seeing those loss of numbers. So just to show you something, this is not because I did it, and I didn't personally, quote unquote, do it, but I'll tell you this. 7 people who were in that life stage, I started a Sunday school class with prior to COVID. I'm trying to remember the exact time. I want to say it's February of 2019. I'm pretty sure it's when we started. We now have a group on Sunday mornings that will range anywhere from 24 to 30 people. And they have spurred a men's class now on Wednesday night that we didn't have. And we have about 12 to 15 people who are coming to that Wednesday night men's class, and only half of that men's class are people of our congregation. They are other folks that are coming. They're coming, and they're studying, and it's growth. It's real growth. It's measurable. That's okay. But, I mean, it's real spiritual growth. You're seeing these men change. I'm seeing these people. And they all, I have people come from a few other congregations, but mostly it's just friends of other people in my congregation. And they just go, I have nothing at where I go to church. They have nothing for us. I'm not throwing stones. I'm not trying to say anything other than what's encouraging. What's encouraging is if you minister to people, they respond because everybody is looking. Even people who don't know about Christianity, they're looking. even, especially those folks. I'm going to talk about that in the lesson during the next hour. But everybody's looking. The question is, are we seeking? And if we're not, maybe that's one of those areas that we could take a good run at. Would you bow with me? We're going to close class with a prayer. Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this good day. It's beautiful outside. It's wonderful inside. And we are granted the peace and the opportunity to meet and to study your word, to look at your church, and to seek ways to grow individually and grow as a body. Thank you for that opportunity. We pray, Lord, that it's all been done in a way that's been pleasing to you. And we pray that as we go into the worship hour, that you'll be with us, that we will seek to adore and to praise you. And we just pray that it be pleasing in your sight as well. And we thank you. We thank you especially for your Son and all he means to our eternity. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. Thank you for your time and attention.